Unsee the future.
Yes, you do. Yes. You wouldn't be here if you didn't want to see the future. Should we go live? Should we do this? Let's do it, gang. Yes, indeed. Hello and welcome to Unsee the Future, the Hopeychattybits, the very first ever episode. I am Timo Peach, and I shall be meeting artists, changemakers, and solarpunks who are reimagining the stories we think we're in. Why am I doing this? Why am I on this mission? Well, you know full well, sausage, if you've been following my work with my idiosyncratic research cast, Unsee the Future, which always has, at the end of it, its hopey changey bit. Well, I want to speak to people who are actively involved with visioning up and testing into and living out and trying out the actual new songs and stories of us. Because what story do you think you're in? I think I'm in something that's constantly trying to tell me everything's hopeless. And I was talking to the lovely First Lady of Momo today, and on the list of massive problems we have on Earth at the moment, the global pandemic forcing us to reimagine everything we do at work and what we want out of life seems really low on the list. So do we ever need to start thinking about new stories of us? And how do we do that? It's my contention that we have to think more like artists and change the world with new ways of seeing. We'll get into that. So who am I having on my first ever show? Well, I could only think of one person that I most wanted to kick this off with. He is a writer, a theorist, and a consultant strategist, specialising in the distributed web and world running. He's the co-founder of solarpunks.net. He's the maker of 301 Permanently Moved, very successful podcast. And he hosts Come Internet With Me, in which he live dials into the internet with guests to see what rabbit holes of search engine madness they fall down. He says we have access to an abundance of independently created art from all over the world, and yet the kinds of movies being made and the types of stories that are getting told seem to be totally unoriginal, regurgitated or rebooted. In his key article, Solarpunk, Life in the Future Beyond the Rusted Chrome of Yestermorrow, he says, in order to continue to profitably mine the stable expectations of the wider cultural imagination, mainstream culture has to continually frack the past to create future material. He is a man very much after my own heart. He's a lovely chap who I can't wait to have a decent chat with you, dear viewer and listener. Together, I could only have invited the one and only Jay Springett.
Hello, thank you.
Welcome to the show. And, you know, you have the dubious honour of being the very first guest on the Hopeychattybits.
It will get better as it goes along, I'm sure.
No, it's starting on a high for me, man. And thank you for joining me. It is 9 o'clock in LA. It's midday in New York. And it's 5 o'clock in Bournemouth. But where in the world are you?
I'm in South London. So it's 5 o'clock here too.
How convenient.
Yeah.
Greenwich Mean Time. You're nearer Greenwich than I am. Mate, it's great to have you on the show, and I have delighted.
It's my pleasure.
I've delighted in following much of your work over the last year since we first spoke. I quoted you in my special episode 31 of Unsee, looking at Solarpunk. I quoted you loads before I'd met you, and then I met you and we had a great chat. You seem right at the heart of the Solarpunk movement.
I would say that I was at the center of the spiral of the Solarpunk movement when it first began, but not so much anymore. More of a peripheral voice as Solarpunk has continued to grow and grow and grow, and you know, more and more people have got involved.
So you're like, as you've gone up the spiral farm, you're more on the outskirts now. But why do you feel that way?
I mean, it's not that I necessarily feel excluded. I mean, just to go through the history of sort of my involvement in Solarpunk, I first found out about or heard of Solarpunk back in 2012 on a mailing list that was full of writers, creatives, designers, so on and so forth. Futurists were. It was just a very active mailing list back when those were still a thing.
Okay.
Yeah, if you remember. So that was around 2012. And one of the people that was on that mailing list was Adam Flynn, who wrote the very first essay on Solarpunk, which is on the need for new futures. And that's on the blog solarpunks.net, which I later joined in 2014.
Right.
Around 2012 and 2013, at the very beginning of Solarpunk, the only thing really that existed of Solarpunk in the imaginative sphere, let's say, was a book called Solarpunk, an anthology published in Brazilian Portuguese in Brazil.
Yes.
Which wasn't translated into English until I think the Kickstarter may have been 2017, but I think it was released in 2018.
It's something like that. Now, hold that thought, because of course, obviously, I've got to show it on camera, because there it is. There's the English language version.
Yes.
What a classic.
So that was the only information that we had, was that there was a book in a trilogy of different punks: diesel punk, atom punk, and solar punk in Brazilian Portuguese, and that there was a whole solar punk writing scene and still is, that's in Brazil. And because of the dominance of the English language and the selfishness of that, we've yet to, and how expensive it is to get it translated. But there is a lot of solarpunk writing out there that has yet to see, English language publication.
Well, I agree with that. And if I might jump into that part of the story, it strikes me that one of the founding texts, you might call that collection, does hail from Brazil, and so much Solarpunk does. When I think of the imagery that comes to mind in Solarpunk, it's so Brazilian. It's a country of such contrast, such vastness, depth, lushness. So many things are happening there. It's got, all that oil in the Campos Basin. At the same time, it's been one of the more progressive kind of environmental energy distributors. It's a fascinating place, and I really want to go. Have you ever been to Brazil?
I have not, but I'm internet friends with an author called Anna Rusch, who is also a Solarpunk author. Right. And one of the things that she continually reminds me is that in Brazil, the it's not even the notion of the favela as a setting for, say, cyberpunk novels, or it's a reality in Brazil. Like the shanty towns and the poverty living right next door to very 21st century cities is a reality. And just like the community spirit and the various things that happen in those favelas, especially like around appropriate technologies for rainwater harvesting and people growing things and so on and so forth, like that has that inspiring, it's real rather than just a setting for a sci-fi story, if that makes sense.
Yes, it is. And very hands-on, as you say, which feels to me, as I'm getting to know the idea of Solarpunk, it's so key to it. It's a testable, real world kind of thing that has an aesthetic that can't help but be a bit right to repair and scavenging things, but also with a nod to high tech. And the stories that come out of it tend to feel like that, which is, quite Brazilian, isn't it? Not to romanticize it, but
it's interesting when you talk about the aesthetic, actually, because in the early days of Solarpunk, the aesthetic of Solarpunk as an idea, let's say, rather than, now I would I've written, but I would class it as, a movement in art, fashion, activism, and speculative fiction. It's all of those things sort of wrapped up in one.
Yeah.
But in the early days of Solarpunk, right at the very beginning of that, right at the very beginning of the blog, when Adam wrote on the need for new futures, there's a couple of open questions that he has at the end of the essay. And one of them is, what is the aesthetic? because it's interesting. Like there's a Dr. Rhys Williams is a sci-fi scholar, let's say, and he wrote about how Solarpunk began as a container, and it's Solarpunk is very internet first, because unlike other genres or other ideas that you would be familiar with, like cyberpunk, or there's like steampunk, or even the golden age of sci-fi or space operas.
Yeah.
The idea of Solarpunk came first, and then it's being filled in by people writing stories. Whereas usually it happens the other way around, where you have a set of stories, which is known as the megatext, that then are grouped together to become, these are cyberpunk novels. Does that make any sense? So the concept of Solarpunk came first before we got any stories.
And that's almost and that's almost an invitation to then move yourself into the experience of creating it, isn't it? Here's an idea.
Yes, yeah,
Oh, that's
very much by design. Solarpunk originally, in those early days, when the question, what does the aesthetic look like, feels exactly the same as the internet works even now, because it was kind of born from Tumblr. So it was very much like an image or a text or a quote or a video, a permaculture video, Jeff Lawton or someone like that, like one of his early internet, like the Greening the Desert video, which is sort of like his most famous classic video. All of those things would be posted on the Solarpunk hashtag. And I mean, I remember, like, I do actually have grey in my beard now, so I can say this.
But, I probably have more than you do, but see, we can both stroke our chins here and sound terribly knowledgeable.
But Solarpunk's aesthetic was some sort of mix of the age of sail, like tea clippers and water wheels, and but with bicycles and bloomers kind of thing, like very much, and also appropriate technology, and solar panels obviously were everywhere, and people were tracking the price of just how quickly the price of solar was dropping. Literally it was like every 3 months in the early 2010s. I don't think people remember how quickly the cost of solar has dropped.
Yes.
Or the price of solar.
Yeah.
But so it was all of those things were going around. Like, people were posting all these like beautiful 18th century paintings of tea clippers and, sort of age of sail type stuff. And then in 2014, two things sort of happened within a couple of weeks of each other. The first was that Miss Olivia Louise, who has a Tumblr blog called Musks and Jewels, posted a post about Solarpunk where they drew together artwork by Imperial Boy, who is a Japanese artist. And when you Google Solarpunk now, it's mostly Imperial Boy images that you'll see.
Yes.
But so the Tumblr user Miss Olivia Louise sort of took Imperial Boy's work and was like, this is something like Solarpunk. And then they themselves drew a whole bunch of like costume design based on Art Nouveau kind of influences, and then they just listed a whole bunch of ideas. Basically, there's a whole paragraph that's literally just like comma Art Nouveau, comma bright colors, earth tones, permaculture education in schools, community. It just goes on and on. Do you know what I mean? Which again kind of feels like that invitation to throw your ideas into the container that is Solarpunk.
I like that idea, especially because it's almost a metaphor pun, a punaphor, I don't know, of thinking of container ships and how we like to containers from container ships, and obviously reapportion that feels quite that way. I had a brilliant quote on my little taster video that I did for my amigos the other night of this, and a mate of mine has been a really useful kind of challenge to my liberal entitled getting carried awayness. Matt always comes back with economic statistics and realities. He said, Solarpunk, don't think it's working for you, mate, as a moniker, because cyberpunk, well, that's been done 100 times. Steampunk, what even is that? Solarpunk, been around 14 years, nobody's heard of it. But I wonder what made you so inspired by it, because to me, it seemed to be this weirdly kind of freed idea where all these other aesthetics are kind of playful aesthetics, and Solarpunk implies that, yet suddenly it seemed like something more permaculture. You talk about Jeff Lawton. It just feels like something you can get your hands in the soil with, try things, embody it, and then that whole culture you say about the invitation it is to write stories. This feels to me better than a new utopia. It's something more realistic and practical, yet inspiring. What was it that made you go, I need to go deep on this?
For me, it was honestly just hearing the word solarpunk was basically the
I agree.
the
Everyone says that to me too.
It was, yeah. It's just like it was almost self-explanatory.
Yes.
Given that we have the legacy of cyberpunk and what that became as and the way it has influenced the world, and then we move through steampunk, kind of like as it was a genre of sci-fi, sort of beginning with a difference engine, but then expands into its own genre. And one of the questions that was, one of the really early questions that I remember Solarpunks talking about on Tumblr is just, could you imagine the impact that steampunk could have had on the world culturally if it hadn't been some sort of colonialist imperial fantasy? If it had been committed to decoloniality and an invitation for other futures, Gulf futures, Sino futures, so on and so forth, from the 1800s, and alternate histories and so on and so forth. But instead, it just kind of became this strange, imperialist alternate history reenactment genre. And even if it had only been the third of the size that steampunk ended up being, could you imagine the influence that it would have had on the world?
Yeah, I know, but it seems like to me it feels like a kind of a yearning for old certainties and putting a kind of playful twist. So I enjoy it as a bit of fun, as an aesthetic. When I see cosplayers enjoying it, great. But and I absolutely plan to annex airships and take them with us into the Solarpunk future for lots of reasons. But yeah, it just feels like part of our great stuckness and nostalgia, and that's a big theme of what you've spoken about in the past here, like some of those quotes here. We're stuck in old stories of us, aren't we?
This kind of thinking kind of comes from, I realized I didn't finish my thought from earlier on. I was talking about Mr. Olivia Louise's post, and the second thing that happened was that Adam wrote notes towards a manifesto, Solarpunk notes towards a manifesto for the Helioglyph project, which was Neil Stephenson's collaborative project with ASU's Center for Science and the Imagination, at Arizona State University. And Neil Stephenson, obviously very famous cyberpunk author, and he says that sci-fi or science fiction works works by creating signs or hieroglyphs which people can all rally around and then work towards to actually instantiate within the world, either to move towards or move away from. I mean, there's that meme going around, whatever it is, like author writes eternal torment machine. Silicon Valley company says, good news, we've built the eternal torment machine.
And we're all trapped in the damn thing.
Yeah, exactly. But one of the things that that we were talking about, but one of the things that Adam talks about in that essay, and also in his first essay on the need for new futures several years before, is that we were stuck, or we are still stuck in some sense in it's not a Fukuyama kind of like eternal end of history way, but we are stuck within what Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism, and that we cannot imagine a future because we're kind of stuck in this present. And Solarpunk, in some sense, is an invitation for people to start to begin to think about their own futures, or the future, in new ways. And because of the way that Solarpunk kind of worked and still works, is that it's a gathering together, or a drawing together of ideas that collectively people who are either on the Reddit, the Facebook, Tumblr, wherever you are, you know, Twitter, people are posting things and saying, is this Solarpunk? You know, placing it in the container. And
is it?
Yeah, is it? And some of these things, you know, they're real, like lean-to greenhouses, or, you know, appropriate technologies for capturing rainwater, you know, just like water butts are pretty damn Solarpunk, you know what I mean? So what Solarpunk tries to do is not so much to think about the future in a utopian way, but to gather the practical solutions that exist already in the world or have previously been overlooked, and then as part of its world building, you take all of these things that exist or have been overlooked, and then you project them forwards and multiply them outwards. So what would, as a simple thought experiment, what would a British suburb look like if everyone had chickens in their backyard, as we would have had in the 1950s post-war?
Yeah.
You know, like, just as an example.
But what I like about the idea of Solarpunk is that whilst you might just, you know, move the chickens around by hand, you may well have some sort of sensor in there giving you live soil data to a more granular view. But at the same time,
face recognition on each of the chickens.
I mean, probably, because it's where we can still embrace a love of tech, even though I think tech is a cult and horribly destructive, but because it's a sort of single bandwidth thing rather than in a polycultural environment. You talk about, you say you're interested in the creation of hybrid environments, talk about pulling people together, where you say organizational design, high growth scenarios, basic needs, culture, agency, etc. All those different things, from really what I call consciousness down to encouragement, that kind of super macro to super local. How do you get involved with that sort of thing yourself? How can you encourage that in the workplace, in business? How do you get involved with trying to work up those, how you put those things together?
I mean, it's funny, really, because I, in a former life, I worked as a operations manager at several startups, and specifically startups that were growing really fast.
Right.
And it's just amazing how many times groups of people go through, oh, we need to implement a new system. We need a new piece of software. Do you know what I mean?
Great.
Like, yeah.
Wonderful.
Whatever it is, new piece of, you know, just because if you go from 3 people to 10 people to 30 people, then, you know, suddenly the way it was working when it was just the 3 founders or whatever, you know, everything falls over very quickly.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I used to stress is that when you are picking a piece of software and the way that you're designing that piece of software to work kind of ontologically in some sense, you know, like whether you're going to set it up, that's the hybrid environment that you're creating, because you're going to live and think inside this piece of software, and so is everybody else.
Oh, God, just let me stop you there. That idea, you're gonna live and think inside Microsoft Teams, or whatever it be, and it's going to be a massive part of the environment of your experience of being alive every day. I just want to cry, Jay. I just want to take a moment and cry for us all, just on that. Anyway, yes, go on.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big deal. I mean, and it shouldn't be, you know, it's one of the, like, and when you start to talk about it like this, then you can start to, you know, talk to people who are within the organization, you know, do all of that, getting people on board with the new processes and blah, blah, blah. If you stress, if you start to talk about things this way, rather than it being a tool that you're going to use, it's somewhere that I mean, we've all been working from home during the pandemic. It's, you know, as you say, Microsoft Teams is where we're going to go for 8 hours a day.
Oh, yes. And I see the effect it has on my wife.
But that's a hybrid environment for me, is any techno-social environment. Yeah. Basically, like techno-social environment where those things are all kind of in intersection. Yes. And the way in which those things are created, or at least understood, is through narratives about whatever it is that is going to be going on inside these things. So so that's kind of how, in some sense, how narrative strategy works. It's either you start to begin writing narratives to understand what's inside the container of the technosocial system, for example, or the technosocial system in itself, like the workplace or the community or whoever it is that are all working together, they themselves generate their own kind of narrative coming upwards.
And do you sort of create, I mean, quite creative experiences to help them get inside that sense of story and change the story they think they're in? How do you sort of
personally, in my
take their
work,
hand?
I don't. No, so personally, there's a really you have to get them on the show. If you heard of Commando Yggdrasil?
No, I want to say yes and just sound clever, but
No,
I'm not like that.
you're gonna have to speak to them because those guys are great. They work with narrative and communities, and at the moment they're doing a lot of work with community veg gardens and producing sci-fi stories. The community themselves who are working on the project are writing their own short sci-fi stories.
Right, I've got it. So write that down. Community veg garden, science fiction LARPing experiences. They're booked. They're just booked now. Yep. I've got people on it.
Well, I mean, this is that you talk about LARPing, but I've said this before about Solarpunk several times, is that you can't LARP being a Solarpunk, because being a Solarpunk is going out and planting a garden.
Yes, it's not role play, but then amen and yes, and you just blew my mind. And at the same time, if we're all in a story, then everything's role play, isn't it? And so trying to change the story you're in is moving your body into different what if things. So yes, we maybe.
Well, instead of playing a role, maybe you are an actor. To use political language, you become an actor.
And indeed, and that is, of course, a short step in the word activist, and that is a big part of Solarpunk in a sense, isn't it? This sort of, but often super local. I think one of the articles that you've been quoted in from a few years ago, and the person says this sort of delight and mystification in their, maybe even their stand first. So I'm talking to Jay Springett about Solarpunk, and he immediately comes back and starts talking about putting seed trays into old phone boxes. Yes.
Yep.
I mean, yeah, because that's completely hands-on, making up, trying to reapportion things in a more intersectional way, as well as a more right to repair empowered way. So Solarpunk's distributed, isn't it, naturally, because it's a decentralized concept, as we're talking about. I mean,
speaking of decentralization, though, we should also mention that the solar in Solarpunk is not just kind of like a bright future, but it is also like grounded in the technological shift that is occurring with the move to renewables, whether it be solar, solar panels, or whether it's all the different forms of green energy, turbines and so on and so forth. But the thing is, it's not just like there's two forms of power, right? There is both like electrical power that we can talk about, and we can also talk about power in the the Foucault sense of power, and who has it and who gets to use it on others. And a move to a distributed grid, which is what renewables promise, means that it also is a crowbar, let's say, or a useful fulcrum to begin to think about the redistribution of power, in society. Because like if you start to look at the kind of the politics of infrastructure, which was a kind of political thing that I was very interested in before I heard about Solarpunk. And for my sins, I coined the term stacktivism.
You did. I should have quoted that because it is an excellent phrase.
As in like the study of the stack or the accidental megastructure, which is the planetary scale infrastructure, and then the activism part is obviously the inquiry, or at least the active inquiry about it, rather than just critique. And like one of the very early Solarpunk stories that everyone agreed upon, like a real life Solarpunk story, was Spain's attempts to ban rooftop solar off grid.
Right.
Because it was a political question, and it was went all the way through into the courts, because it was, if you can live off grid, then you are less dependent on the state. When you put it that way. So so it's also important to think about that, like Solarpunk does have this like inquiry into distributed infrastructure kind of baked in.
That's it. Yeah, and it does. And again, all the intersectionality of that, the idea that you are all at once thinking as somebody agent, and if you're agent, and even just testifying, you are questioning the status quo in a way, but also you're thinking about then testing things and trying things, but also it's an emotional and aesthetic response all at once. That's what I feel Solarpunk unlocked in me as an imagination exploder, and it's so sort of quiet but endless and realistic seeming to me. How much do you think?
I mean, Adam Flynn's not Adam Flynn, it's Andrew Dana Hudson's like a pithy phrase from his essay in 2015 is Solarpunk's motto is to move quietly and plant things.
That's it. I love that phrase.
Yeah.
it's wonderful. But then again, you know, there'll be lots of people, whenever you come up against great big machines and scale and all the, you know, this is the imagery that James Cameron gave us cheesily, but obviously on Pandora, these great big machines eating trees, and then these delicate but strong creatures moving amongst there is something about that sort of avatar-y view as well. It can seem a bit silly, and well, you go and sit on your farm then and sit off grid and you can live in a fantasy world. But how do you feel about this now, some years in, and the work you're doing now, as well as the stories of Solarpunk? How do you feel about the way this is unfolding at the moment, and sense of empowerment for you or for people that you know in all this?
That's a really good question. I mean, first of all, just thinking about like the James Cameron kind of, it's also it also gets thrown at Solarpunk as a genre as well.
Yeah, it does.
Like that. And I mean, I don't know if you've read Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta. It's one of the most important books I've read recently. But in that book, he's an Aboriginal scholar from Australia, and his book is really fantastic. Really recommend it. But in that book, he says a crude metaphor is a curse, or a bad metaphor is a curse. So that kind of, I kind of think that like the James Cameron movie is a curse rather than.
I thought you might, but also, but it illustrates the sort of futility that then does get thrown at you, daring to sort of say something that's quieter, or the idea that, you know, all is one, all is love, and yet the idea, whether helped by psychedelics or spirituality or just common sense, that all is one, everything's connected, and what's the point actually in building big machines to smash things? There's that sense of something almost spiritual going on under this, but it's driven by logic and observation and individual sort of letting go of the old lies in a way, isn't it? I'm getting poetic.
Yeah. To some respect, I think that Rob Cameron, who is a writer from New York, he's actually written quite a lot of critique of Solarpunk as a genre, contrasting it to Afrofuturism, which is the genre that he writes in. Talking about the lack of spirituality and spiritual engagement in Solarpunk stories.
Interesting.
On the whole, which is a very valid critique. I personally think that it is perhaps says more about the editors of certain, of the sensibilities of editors than it does about the people who are writing Solarpunk. Because if you were to write a spiritual Solarpunk story, does anyone think that they're going to get it published? And the answer is no. I don't think they would.
That's interesting. Well, and that I hadn't thought about that, because to me, the idea of something beyond and indigenous views that carry these things with us. So hence Afrofuturism, of course, has that baked into the soil of it, as I would say an awful lot, depending on who's writing it, of Brazilian writing would, whether it's, where you're in the asphalt.
It's ironic, really.
It is ironic, because I think it implies, a lot of spirituality. So that's interesting. You're saying actually culturally, in a way, Solarpunk's still a little bit wedded to the tech verse.
The first manifesto that I ever wrote written by Solarpunk is by Solarpunk Witchcraft. So it is there. It is there. It's just we're just in a funny position.
Yeah, I've just had a message from
equivalent.
Is there a Solarpunk equivalent, says Andy Robinson, of the goggles and top hat dress code? All good movements need an outfit. Well, what would you say to that? Because I can picture something.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, there's people who are inspired by Solarpunk fashion goes in kind of two ways. But Solarpunk fashion is either the kind of creation of reused and recycled materials, like upcycled clothing. And I don't know if you know about the red thread movement. That was very popular in the Solarpunk kind of.
Yes,
If you're going to
that does ring a
if
bell.
you're going to repair a hole in your shirt or in a jumper, regardless of what color it is, you use a red thread to show that it's been repaired, which is an unusual thing that happens in.
I love the idea of that. It seems very activist and student, and obviously I'm not going to do that for more than like one thing. And I'll wear that one thing to the rally, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, if like the whole world's going to shit, so we're gonna have to. We're not gonna be able to afford to buy new clothes anymore.
And actually, sewing is something I've never learned to do. I'm used to looking
it's well
after
worth
myself,
it.
but...
I did that thing where you don't buy any new clothes for a year, and that definitely taught me how to sew properly.
Yes, I think it would be quite empowering, like the promise I've made to myself to finally learn music theory a bit better than I know it. I'm sure I'll get around to that, and speaking French and learning to code. These are all things I will definitely do
on the list
when the machine collapses. I would say, before we get to our last sort of segment, to bring it right down to a personal level, I find it interesting for you as somebody who is a very... a complex thinker in many ways, although you reduce things beautifully to understandable simplicity and storytelling, all the different things you hold in tension, all the things you do. You've been saying you struggle with the basic creative problem of procrastination and of how to get things done because maybe your brain is in so many places at once. It doesn't seem that way from the outside, but how are you coping with that at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it was just before the new year that I wrote this, right? Or was it like...
Yeah, you were struggling into the new year.
That's 3 months, anyway.
I'm going to get really productive now, you said.
Yeah, and that hasn't happened at all. One of the things that I find personally is that I respond very well to rhythm.
Ooh.
Rather than structure. I respond very well to rhythm. So I know that I have to start working on my podcast every Thursday, and then it's got to go out on the goes out on the Saturday, and so on and so forth. And those are like the rhythms that happen within my life. And one of the things that I do is just to make sure that I have... I mean, it sounds like a structure. I'm doing certain things on certain days, but I always get to this point where everything's moving along, everything's beating along, and then you're like, oh, I want to do something else, and then you put the new thing in to work on the new project, and then everything falls apart. The rhythm just falls apart.
Yes, I like that idea.
Need a conductor.
You do. Well, we all need a conductor. I think that's called a PA, exactly. or just a really shouty client helps me get things done. But
same.
You were talking about the principle of the pinhole, and I wonder whether that's how we stay sane and progressive in the practical sense. We've got to kind of do this impossible thing of regularly zooming out and getting a global picture, and then is it dialing into something super local, staying in the pinhole in order to actually make progress right where we are and own it, but with a sense of great context?
I think it is something like that. One of the things that I think is important about Solarpunk, for people that encounter Solarpunk, because as we've been saying, it's an invitation for people to think about think about the future themselves, is that if you are introduced to the ideas of permaculture or regenerative agriculture, or any of those simple ideas, or David Holmgren's Retro Suburbia book, which is just full of really great ideas for doing the retrofitting of suburbs and so on and so forth, is that sites not only become sites are a place of possibility, but it's not just narrative possibility, it's also actual possibility. That unused scrubland out the back of Tesco's is a site for the narrative of we should put a food forest there, community food forest. And then, but it is also full of the potential to actually do that thing. Or, you walk past somewhere else and you think, oh, they could fix that with a swale.
Yes, of course they could.
Fix that flood with a dam on contour, and then, so it's both narrative possibility, but also actual possibility. And that's kind of what I mean, I've called Solarpunk a mimetic engine. So the point is that your interaction with the engine, or the mimetic engine of Solarpunk, is that it gives more ideas back than you put into it.
That's amazing, which is the most regenerative idea that's regeneration, full stop. Giving
Yep.
more, harvesting more than you, giving more than you take out. Amazing.
Yep. Yeah, a generous mimetic engine is what we should be aiming to create when we're talking about futures, not just Solarpunk, but in what other mimetic engines can we start to share with one another.
And implied in that too is a sense of honoring things, that as you start looking around at the possibility, it honors place, it honors individual, and that's where the power really is, of individuals living in places, owning them and going, we could do this. And doesn't it show how we do indeed all live in a story? Because when you start living out the story, cosplaying it, practicing into it, it becomes real. And so
well, I mean, this is one of the things, like Solarpunk's aesthetics now, when you have a look, the aesthetics of Solarpunk arise from praxis.
Yes.
So like, people who are doing the things are creating things that look Solarpunk. So if you do the same things too, then, that's why the aesthetics look a certain way.
Well, true. And I've always said that if we were to beam forward 1,000 years and we finally cracked the basics of how to manipulate gravity and we're flying around in actual spaceships and we're a multi-world species, you bet your ass we will all be driving Falcons and Liberators and Enterprises, because we've already taught ourselves that that's what we want. And sure enough, the Falcon Heavy, it looks like a 50s B-movie rocket.
Yeah, it does.
So we're just fulfilling our own, what we were teaching ourselves the future now in lots of ways that I'm sure will be hanging around for centuries.
What's the there's both the term hyperstitions, but there's also who's the guy that writes about drama, where he talks about where you're kind of like that sympathetic magic of acting something out on stage for it to become real in real life. I can't remember.
No, but that sympathetic magic that's what
Gerard?
we're trying to spin. Is it?
I can't remember.
We can do a search. We can go internet together and do a search. But I think sympathetic magic is definitely the sort of thing we're trying to encourage here. So, I mean, I'd love to chat to you for another couple of hours, but people in LA have got to finish their breakfast and get on with productive days.
Go out for a run along the seafront.
Along the seafront, obviously, surely. And I'm going to have to do that in Bournemouth. But the last piece that I'd like to ask you is a little segment. And I'd like to ask you, I'll insert a jingle here probably. I'll brand it up properly, won't I? But I'd like to ask you what you would like to leave for future generations as your ancestral artifact.
I was thinking about this after you emailed me recently, and I think I would probably I won't say it, but I think if I was to leave something in an ancestral vault for the future, it would be my family prayer that my parents taught me, and is the one they taught me is very similar to the one that they were taught, and so on and so forth. Mainly, not that I don't think that there will be prayer in the future. It's mainly that it is a recognition of where these things come from and where they are going. Like the act of prayer, let's say, for want of a better word, is fundamental to the human experience, and we've been doing it for probably as long as we've been human. In some sense, and that is why I would like to leave my one in the vault for the future, for people to rediscover in some sense the way But yeah, that's what I would leave. And
have you got the prayer? Have you got it there that you can share it with us?
No, I'm not going to read it.
Okay, maybe it's personal, but I was thinking, this is a great way to segue out of the show. You'll leave a poignant prayer poem, and I'll say thanks, Jay Springett, and punch straight out to the end jingles, and that would have been poetic, mate. So but I like the idea of that, though, and I again, there's the implicit spirituality. And I will just, in that which case, I'll bring in Peter John Cooper. Hey, Peter, this is really engaging. He says, any perspective on the long now? Well, I think this is all a long now, but have you got a comment on that before we leave?
Big fans of Long Now. I know quite a lot of the early Solarpunk contributors who are all based on the West Coast used to go to the Long Now talks quite a lot. And I know the editor of Long Now Foundation in the States, actually, and I'm a really big fan of the way that they've been thinking. They've been doing a lot important work for a long time.
Yes, it's kind of their thing.
Yeah, and I think that we would definitely be in a worse off position in 2022 if they hadn't been doing the work for 40 years or however long they've been around. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, there's something sort of monastic in it, isn't there? Holding space. That's what monasteries and nunneries were for centuries in their eyes. It was holding spiritual space, praying for the world, and being the sort of engine of spirituality for the world. That was the view of people then, and in a way, this is their prayers over us, if you want to use that language, has been the work they've been doing of trying to think about a completely different scale of understanding how we live. And at the same time, you and I have got to come back to the pinhole and just say, I live here now in this moment. And as of now, the world hasn't blown up. My world is still here. My legs still work. My brain still works.
Yep. And the spring seeds have got to be done this weekend.
And I think that's our punchline out. Jay, thank you so much. Jay Springett, it's been marvelous to have you on the show, and as our first ever guest. Ciao for now, man, and thank you ever so much.
Cheers. Thanks.
Unsee the future.
Yeah, and so obviously I went to a logo at the end. That's pretty final, but I'd like to do a little sum up and say, isn't that marvelous? If you want to listen this back, we will be putting this out as an audio podcast every week. And for the next now 9 weeks, there will be further guests joining me on the show, exploring different themes that are quite solarpunk in nature, but also just part of that regenerative longer now that's also living in the now. The long now, living in the now. There's something in that. It's a bit contrived, but I can do something. We can just write it down. We can do something with that. Hey, Sausage, thank you for following me today and for joining Jay and I in our first chat together. Could have talked to him for hours. Do check out thejmo.net. Links are below to all his stuff. Well worth reading his articles, catching up on his shows, and a lot of the things that he's thought and shared. And I have no doubt he and I will be talking again soon. Join me next week. It will be going out at 1700 GMT, same time, with my next guest. And follow me at unseethefuture.com, where you can find also links to the book that I'm writing every week, and follow me as an amigo. So ciao for now. And I also need to come up with a line, a thing for leaving this. It's a new format. I haven't got this. Anyway, never mind. See you soon.